Leo served in the Régiment de la Chaudière, was a French-speaking infantry regiment in the Canadian Army. It was one of those regiments that rarely made headlines, but almost always found itself where the going got tough. They weren't spared. They were used for reconnaissance, breakouts, night missions, anywhere men were needed who could march silently and return, not always at full strength. By the spring of 1944, the regiment had already undergone training that would have broken many even before their first battle. Night marches, navigating without maps, operating in small groups, constant training under blank, and then live ammunition. Leo ended up in the reconnaissance unit, not because he asked to be there, but because he fit in. He didn't panic. He didn't argue. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. And he almost always returned. The Normandy landings were their unit's first real baptism. The 6th day of June, 1944 Regiment de la Chaudière, a ray landed on Juno Beach. It wasn't the most media-friendly beach, but there was plenty of fire there. German machine guns were firing reliably, artillery covered the beach exits, and the terrain offered no cover. Leo landed in the first wave. He saw people die in the water. He saw those who reached the shore lie down and never rise. It was there that he first understood that war is not a moment, but a process in which fear does not disappear, but simply becomes a background. After Normandy, their unit hadn't had a break. Advancing deep into France, constant clashes, cleared villages, ambushes. Scouts marched ahead of the main forces, sometimes several kilometers away. Sometimes at night, without communication. Their mission was simple in formulation and deadly in essence. Find out where the enemy was and return alive. During one of these outings, Leo and his group encountered a German patrol. The contact was sudden. The distance was minimal. The grenades flew almost simultaneously. Leo heard a pop, saw a flash, and in that same second, the world to his left disappeared. A shrapnel hit me in the face. There was no scream, no fall. There was only the sensation of boiling water pouring over half his head. He instinctively fell, pressing his palm to his face, and felt his fingers instantly become wet. He couldn't see out of his left side at all. Nothing. A black void. They pulled him out. Later in the rear, the doctor said calmly and without emotion, "The eye is lost. He's no longer fit for the front lines." Leo listened in silence. Then he said he was returning to his unit. The doctor looked at him the way people look at people who can't be persuaded, and signed the papers marked "at his own request." Technically, he could have remained in the rear. In reality, he had returned to a place where every subsequent battle could be his last. He learned to live with one eye quickly. He learned to shoot, navigate, and move at night. His depth vision was impaired, but experience compensated for it. He became even more cautious, even quieter. By the spring of 1945, the Allies were already entering the Netherlands. The German army was retreating, but it was retreating dangerously. Its units were disorganized, but still armed. Cities were turning into traps. Zwolle was just such a city. Intelligence Régiment de la Chaudière was given a specific task: to determine the garrison size, machine gun positions, and the Germans' readiness for defense. Command did not want an artillery strike. There were too many civilians. Leo Mayer and his partner went out at night. They entered the city cautiously, using shadows, courtyards, and alleys. For several hours, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Then contact. A brief exchange of fire. Bullets sounded different in the narrow alley, louder, closer, without an echo. Leo's partner was killed almost immediately. Not heroic, not beautiful. One bullet. The body fell and didn't move again. Leo stayed nearby for a few more seconds, checking. No use. Then he did what he always did. Memorized the place and moved on. He was left alone in a city full of enemies. According to the regulations, he should have returned. Logically, too. But he looked at the houses, at the windows where soldiers might be, and he realized if he left, tanks and artillery would come in the morning, and the city would be destroyed. He stayed. Not because I wanted a heroic deed, but because I saw no other way out. And only after that did that very night begin. He remained standing next to his partner's body longer than the situation allowed. Not because he hoped. He knew there was no chance. He stood there because his mind needed time to regroup. Just a few minutes ago, there had been two of them. Two silhouettes in the darkness, 2 breaths, 2 glances caught out of the corner of his eye. Now there was only one. Leo dropped to one knee and quickly checked his partner's pockets. Map, compass, ammo, everything that might be useful. He didn't look at his face. He knew this rule all too well. If you look, you lose seconds. And seconds in an enemy city are worth lives. He moved into the shadows and listened. The city was living its own nightlife. Somewhere a door slammed. Someone started talking. German, not anxious, more irritated. The soldiers, who had been in position for a long time, were starting to speak louder. They were getting used to it. They believed the danger was somewhere ahead, not here. Leo realized that he hadn't been noticed yet. According to regulations, he was supposed to return, pass on information, request support. But he had almost no information, only that there was a garrison in the city, that there were many soldiers, and that they felt confident enough to make noise at night. Returning with this meant one thing. The city would be taken by force in the morning. He knew what it looked like. First the artillery, then the tanks, then the infantry. The houses he saw now would be reduced to rubble. The people sleeping behind those walls would be caught in the flames. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He was thinking about the task. And suddenly he realized that the task could be changed. He couldn't liberate the city that sounded absurd even in his head. But he could break the enemy's confidence. This idea didn't come immediately. It was born gradually from the experience of night raids, from dozens of forays into the rear, from understanding how soldiers behave in the dark. He knew one thing. At night, a person hears more than he sees, and fear at night spreads faster than fire. He moved deeper into the city. Now he walked less like a scout and more like a hunter, slowly, with pauses. He chose his routes so that he always had cover. Yards, narrow passages, garden fences. He didn't move in a straight line, but in loops, constantly changing direction. A few blocks later, he heard voices again. This time there were more soldiers. 4, maybe 5. They stood by the truck, smoking. Some were laughing, some were cursing. Not a single one looked toward the dark alley where Leo stood. He watched them for a long time, counted their movements, noted where they looked. His breathing became even, almost imperceptible. In such moments, all unnecessary things disappeared. Only the body and the purpose remained. He fired first. Not a burst, not quickly, one shot, then an immediate step to the side even before the body fell. He didn't check to see if he'd hit. He was already moving. The second shot came from a different place. The third, a few seconds later, this time from the opposite side of the street. Panic set in. The Germans screamed. Some fell. Some ran for the truck. Some fired into the darkness. Bullets hit the walls, the windows, the empty space. No one saw the enemy, but everyone heard the shots from different directions. Leo didn't linger for a second. He left immediately, leaving behind only sound and chaos. He knew if he lingered, they would find him. If he disappeared, the speculation would begin. Within minutes, the city had changed. He sensed it even without visual cues. The tone of voices changed. Commands grew sharper. People started running. Doors slammed. An alarm sounded somewhere. The Germans didn't realize how many were attacking them, and that was the main thing. Leo moved on. He deliberately made noise where there were no soldiers, breaking glass, throwing stones, sometimes firing into the air. He created the illusion of presence, the illusion of an offensive. He wanted the city to live with this threat. In one of the houses, he stumbled upon 2 soldiers who didn't have time to react. He came out of the shadows and approached them unexpectedly. They raised their hands immediately. Fear was in their eyes. Not battle, but fear. They were sure he was just part of something bigger. "Oui, fiela?" asked one, his voice trembling. Leo didn't answer. He simply pointed them in the direction and signaled them to leave. He couldn't lead prisoners. They were a burden to him, but they were useful in other ways. Let them run. Let them tell. He knew that a soldier running away at night spreads fear better than any bullet. He was left alone again. The hours passed. The city no longer slept. The Germans moved in groups, but they moved nervously. They fired at shadows. They called out to each other. They made mistakes. And with each passing hour, it became clear. Confidence was fading, and Leo Mayer was still alone. By midnight, Leo felt the fatigue one feels only after long hours at the limit. Not sharp, not acute heavy, viscous. It accumulated in his shoulders, his legs, the back of his head. Every step required effort, every decision concentration. He stopped in a narrow courtyard and leaned his back against the cold brick wall. He allowed himself to close his eyes for a few seconds. Not because he wanted to rest, but because he needed to collect his thoughts. A mistake here would cost him instant death. He listened. The city now sounded different. Not chaotic, as at the beginning, but tense. The shouts became shorter, the commands sharper. The Germans began to act more cautiously. They no longer ran alone. They gathered in groups. This meant one thing. They realized the enemy was inside the city, but they still didn't know how many there were. Leo knew this moment. This was the most dangerous phase. Panic had already done its job, but now the survival instinct was kicking in. The soldiers searched for logic, searched for a pattern. If they realized he was alone, it would all be over very quickly. He moved on, trying to break any pattern. He shot where it would be logical to expect a group. He showed up where, by all rights, no one should have shown up. He consciously took risks because only risk maintained the illusion. In one of the blocks, he heard approaching footsteps, lots of them. Not a patrol, a squad. They were walking closely, covering each other. Leo realized they were starting to look for him in earnest. He ducked into the entryway and climbed the stairs, careful not to hit the railing. The stairs creaked, and he froze, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped. Someone said something quietly but irritably. Then the footsteps continued. Upstairs, he chose a window overlooking the neighboring street. He quickly assessed the distance, checked for movement. Then a sharp movement, a short leap. He landed awkwardly. Pain shot through his leg, and he barely kept from groaning. Now he was wounded, not seriously, but enough that every movement was a reminder. He gritted his teeth and kept going. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, the city would catch up with him. He stepped out onto the wide street and realized he'd made a mistake. It was too open here. The streetlights cast uneven patches of light. In one of them, he saw movement. Germans, too close, too much. He fired immediately without taking long to aim. Then a second time. Then he threw a grenade not to kill, but to create a sound. The explosion rolled down the street, bounced off the walls, echoed. Shouts, commands. Someone shouted about a flank attack. Leo limped off into the shadows. It was at that moment that he realized that the city itself had begun to retreat. The soldiers retreated, not because they were being pressed, but because they didn't understand where the threat was coming from. Every shot was now perceived as the beginning of an attack. Every sound a signal for an advance. He intercepted another group. They dropped their weapons almost immediately. One shouted that the city was surrounded. Another demanded a retreat. Leo didn't intervene. He simply disappeared again. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the shooting had become sparse, not because it was all over, but because the Germans had begun to retreat. Not in formation, not on orders, in groups, to the outskirts, to where they could retreat without seeing the enemy. Leo sat down on the steps of one of the houses and allowed himself his first long breath that night. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from tension. He felt the pain in his leg growing worse, his strength ebbing away. But the city around him became quieter. As daylight began to break, he heard other footsteps, cautious, familiar, Canadian speech. He stood up, stepped out of the shadows, and saw his own people standing before him. They looked at him as if they didn't believe him. "Where are the Germans?" someone asked. Leo shrugged. "They're gone." Only later, when the city had been completely cleared and it became clear that the garrison had almost completely abandoned Zwolle, did anyone understand the scale of what had happened? Leo Mayer did it alone, not by storm, not by attack, but by fear, silence, and the understanding of how a person breaks down in the dark. For him, it was just another way out. For the city, it was salvation from destruction. This is what true heroic deeds look like. Without witnesses, without shouting, and almost always alone. When dawn finally broke, the city looked as if it had experienced something it did not fully understand. Abandoned helmets, weapons, and ammunition boxes lay scattered across the streets. Some doors were open, Others were broken down. People stood in the windows. They didn't come out right away. They watched cautiously, not believing the silence was real. Germans in Zwolle. Canadian units entered the city without a fight, without artillery preparation, without destroying any neighborhoods. At first, the commanders didn't believe the reports. They expected resistance, an ambush, a trap. But none of this happened. The garrison withdrew during the night, hastily disorganized, abandoning positions they had considered secure the evening before. Only later did it become clear what had happened. Leo Mayer didn't write a report about his heroic deed. He didn't explain exactly how he acted. He simply said that the city was too dangerous to abandon to the enemy. And that was enough. The locals remembered his name. To them, he wasn't a soldier or a hero. He was the man who kept their homes from falling into ruins, the city from being wiped off the face of the earth. The children walked out onto the streets alive the next morning. Zwolle later officially recognized Leo Mayer as its liberator. He himself was calm about it, almost indifferent. He didn't like to talk about that night, not because he was afraid of the memories. He simply didn't think he'd done anything special. He'd done what he felt was right at that particular moment. The war didn't end for him. He continued serving. He participated in other operations. Later, he fought in Korea. He was wounded again. Again, he refused evacuation. His character didn't change, only the fatigue that had been building up over the years. After the war, he returned to his normal life. He worked. He was silent. He rarely spoke of his past. Those who knew him well recalled that he disliked loud places and couldn't stand senseless noise. At night, he sometimes woke up before dawn, a habit he developed during those years that never went away. He never said he was a hero. He said that war is a series of decisions, each of which could be the last, and that more often than not, the most important decisions are made alone, without witnesses or applause. The story of Leo Mayer isn't about numbers. It's not about destroyed enemies, and it's not about legend. This is the story of how one man realized that sometimes fear is a weapon stronger than bullets, and that silence at night can be louder than artillery. Stories like these rarely make it into textbooks. They don't fit into any formula, but they're precisely what real war is made of people who never intended to become symbols, of decisions made in the dark, of cities that survived because someone stood alone and didn't leave.